If you've ever read a technical manual for fun or otherwise, then you've likely observed that just because something is simple does not mean that it will be presented as such. Indeed, between the obscure terms, complex sentence structures, and less than lifelike diagrams, it becomes impossible at times to decipher whether a technical tome belongs to a nuclear warhead or an IKEA futon. Some of the philosophers we have read are much like technical writers in this regard, twisting simple ideas until they become knots of incomprehensibility. Kant, for instance, rarely writes a straightforward paragraph, even though his basic ideas about morality are fairly simple. Other philosophers, however, are less like technical writers and more like old men nursing pipes on porches. Every puffed pronouncement seems simple, seems to speak of nothing more than a day spent on the lake, a long ago lasagna dinner, the heft of a certain World War II bayonet. Yet under this seeming simplicity lurks decades of experience, years of witnessing and participating in birth, death, beauty, and friendship. John Hospers, it seems to me at least, is much more like the old man than the technical writer. Indeed, his philosophy seems, and in fact is, relatively straightforward and easy to read. However, just as the old man's mundane comments hint at a lifetime of wisdom, so too the relative simplicity of Hosper's philosophy hints at something much more complex beneath the surface, something I cannot yet claim to fully understand. I thus can only hope that in my lecture and presentation today I do justice not only to Hosper's simplicity, but also his complexity. Let's begin. The piece by Hospers we read for today begins with a number of scenarios that are problematic for Bentham and Mill's brand of utilitarianism. One of the most important is the following. Suppose a prosecuting attorney stumbles on evidence that proves the defendant innocent. Now, the attorney knows that she is required by law to submit the evidence to court. But the thing is, the defendant has a history of misbehaving at every turn. Even if he is innocent of the crime for which he is on trial, putting him away would clearly benefit society as a whole. What is more, the attorney is fully confident that she can destroy the evidence without anyone finding out. Now, this scene poses a problem for utilitarianism. Remember, Bentham and Mill said that the right action simply is the action that produces the most happiness. So in this case, the utilitarian would have to say that the right action is destroying the evidence. Doing so will put a bad man in jail and so make the world a better place, a happier place. But the thing is, says Hospers, we have a strong sense that the right thing to do here is in fact the precise opposite, that is, to submit the evidence to the court in accordance with the law. And, even if you don't completely agree with Hospers on this one, the scenario is certainly not as cut and dry as utilitarianism claims. So what do we do? One response would be to treat utilitarianism in the manner Snoop Dogg might advise, namely to drop it like it's hot. But Hospers doesn't want to do this because he is convinced that the one pure good is happiness, that the good life consists in maximum pleasure and minimum pain. So then, since Hospers agrees with Bentham and Mill on what the good life is, he must propose that they go wrong in their proposed means of achieving this good life, if he wants to clear up the problems posed by the lawyer's dilemma above. And indeed, this line of argumentation is precisely the one Hospers takes. Namely, Hospers argues that Bentham and Mill were wrong to argue that happiness is best achieved by acting directly so as to produce it, by judging actions according to the greatest happiness principle, and so treating them as central to ethics. Instead, we should be judging rules according to the greatest happiness principle, acting according to the rules that lead to happiness. Okay, Hospers, nice proposal, but first, what exactly do you mean by rule, and second, how does it clear up the scenario with the lawyer? First then, by rules, Hospers basically means something like guidelines. A rule, in other words, tells you what you should do, regardless of the particulars of your situation, or the fact that you're the one making the decision. So a rule would say something like don't lie, or don't cheat, or don't kill, or don't ride the roller coaster if you're less than 5 feet tall. Hospers rules thus ask to consider whether it would be good for everyone to do a certain action. Now, this should remind you of Kant's categorical imperatives. Remember, the categorical imperative also tells us we should ask ourselves whether our actions would be good for everyone to do. Remember, however, that Kant's categorical imperatives were considered good simply in the fact that they were universally applicable. For Hosper's rules to be good, however, they must actually produce more happiness in the world. So, for instance, while don't lie is a good categorical imperative simply because it applies to everyone, it is a good rule only if it actually does result in more pleasure than pain. Having thus fleshed out exactly what Hospers means by rules, let's see if he's right and rules do clear up the problems presented to utilitarianism by the lawyer. Remember, as her action of destroying evidence would produce the most happiness in the world, typical utilitarianism, or act utilitarianism, would have to say that this action is right, even though our intuition tells us this isn't so. But what if, instead of asking whether the action of destroying the evidence would produce the most happiness, we ask instead whether a rule of evidence destruction would produce the most happiness? Is it the case, in other words, that happiness would best be achieved by everyone destroying evidence when they saw fit? Clearly, this sort of rule would lead to less, not more, happiness in the world. If everyone could destroy evidence when they saw fit, many innocent people would wind up in jail and the judicial system would fall apart, not what we would want to call a happy ending. We can thus say that destroying the evidence would be wrong. Therefore, just as Hospers claimed, if we depart from Mill and Bentham and say that we should measure rules rather than actions by the happiness they produce, utilitarianism is saved from the problems presented by the lawyer's dilemma. Having thus accomplished what he set out to do, Hospers must answer one more question, one which is not readily apparent, but one that is still necessary to address if his idea of following rules that lead to happiness is going to stand. Namely, how specific should a rule be? It can't, for one thing, be too general. We can't have a rule, in other words, like never lie. Indeed, a rule this generic simply won't work, because if everyone always told the truth, no matter what, the world wouldn't be a happier place. It seems like we want exceptions to this rule, some of them at least, such as never lie except to save a life. However, a rule can't be too specific either, or it ceases to apply to everyone, and so ceases to be a rule as Hospers defines it. Let's take, for instance, the rule, don't lie unless your name is Joe Vukov on a Friday morning writing a lecture for ethics in a pair of blue jeans and a t-shirt. Even if acting according to this rule would produce the most happiness, we wouldn't want to call it a rule, as the only person it could possibly apply to is myself. What Hospers thus suggests, that will both allow exceptions to rules while still keeping them from becoming too specific, is the notion of relevancy. In other words, if we are to add any exception to a rule, it must be the case that the exception actually allows the rule to produce more happiness. This is all that Hospers means by relevancy. So, for instance, it is not likely that Friday mornings or the wearing of blue jeans changes the effects of telling lies. Therefore, these are not relevant exceptions to the rule of lying. However, it does seem that allowing someone to die does have an effect on the effects of being truthful all the time, and therefore saving lives does seem to be a relevant exception to the rule against telling lies. With this, then, Hospers has presented a strong case that rule-utilitarianism is both viable and demonstrable. It is true that this case ends up being rather complex, but perhaps this shouldn't count against the theory. For, as Hospers points out, the world is rarely a simple place, and we should not expect a system that tells us how to thrive within it to be simple either.